Welcome, colleagues, to our discussion of international student education in China. And is China an exceptional case in international education? And to take us into China, we have with us Wen Wen and Dear Hu. I'll introduce them properly in a moment. Let me take you through the webinar protocols. Now, remember that the webinar is being recorded. It goes onto YouTube usually within 24 hours or so. And we're finding that people are watching it on YouTube even more than they're watching it during the live session. We also post a transcript of the chat function along with the link to the recorded webinar on the CGHE website after the webinar. Now, please keep yourself muted during the webinar. We don't want to pick up all your interesting background noise, really. But when you're called in to ask a question or make a statement, by all means, turn on your mic at that point. You don't need to keep your camera on either during the webinar, but we'd like you to use it if you can, if it's working for you, when you ask a question, take part in the discussion. We recommend that you use speaker view so you can more clearly who's talking. That speaker view command is in the top right-hand corner of your Zoom screen. Now, to ask a question, and the Q&A is a very important part of the webinar, usually about half the time, we hope. Use the chat function first. Bring forward your question or your statement if you want to make a statement, and into the chat in written form so that we can then select you in to the Q&A. Generally, if you come in early, if your question or your statement are related to the subject matter of the seminar, we'll put you straight into the discussion as soon as it starts. Sometimes people coming in late miss out on getting their questions heard. So as I say every time, do write your question or your statement out as early as you can in the discussion process. And in fact, if you want to do it towards the end of the speakers, it's probably a good idea. Now, when you're invited in, and I'll send you a note in the chat just to warn you it's coming, but when you're invited in, you unmute yourself, most important step, switch on your video and state your name and where you are from. Everyone always forgets to do this, even though we say it each time. And then you ask your question or make your statement. Well, thanks, Trevor, for putting on the webinar protocols as you do each time. And let me introduce my valued colleague, Wen Wen. It's a great pleasure, Wen, to have you in the webinar. We used to say she was a rising star, but she has now, I think, risen. She's a major player in our field of higher education studies worldwide, currently an associate professor in higher education at Tsinghua in China at the Institute of Education, and she's also vice director of the University's Center for Asian Studies. She works on a range of topics in higher education research. You'll hear some of them today, but she's pretty strong across the whole comparative and international domain. She also works on curriculum and teaching and student-related issues as well. So she's in the core, if you like, or the mainstream of higher education studies. Doesn't just do all these flaky, interesting, theorized and political problems. She also works on real higher education topics. Very wise. She's recently been a Fulbright scholar at Harvard University, and she worked also for a little time at the Center for International Higher Education at Boston College, with whom we have a continuing cooperation. So as we do with Tsinghua, and it's very good to have you here, Wen. We have your colleague, Hamish Coates, I think, also presenting a little later, and we would hope, that scholars from Tsinghua will come forward with more webinars ideas, and are very welcome, to take part in our program. Dear Hu is with Wen, and she's a postdoctoral fellow at the Institute of Education at Tsinghua, and her work spans across international student mobility and experience, faculty life, and organizational research networks in global science, a very interesting topic, and which a number of our current doctoral students at Oxford are working on, interestingly. Her current research is examining emerging patterns of international student mobility. And of course, there's a lot to say there, isn't there, with the pandemic and also with the shift to East Asia, but the continuing dominance of the UK and the US, quite remarkable how that Anglo-American dominance sort of hangs on in international education. So without any further preliminaries, let me hand over to you, Wen, and to you, Dear, and wish you the best for today's webinar.
Okay. Thank you, Simon. Thank you very much for the introduction. And also thanks for CGHE for providing us the opportunity to share our thoughts on international student education in China. Can you hear me?
Very
Is that
well.
clear? Yeah, because sometimes the connection is not good, but it's fine. Okay. Yeah, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. My name is Wen, and I'm an associate professor at Institute of Education, Tsinghua University. Yeah, the other speaker who is going to present with me together tonight is Dr. Hu Die. She's working with me on several research projects on student mobility, global scientific collaboration, etc. In the next 30 minutes, Dia and I will share some of our studies on international student education in China. The topic is still important, although the global pandemic has hindered student mobility and international collaboration to a great extent. So far, China's border is still closed to most foreign countries. Hopefully, there will be some changes after the Winter Olympics in February 2022. Student mobility will gradually resume. The pattern and the trend of mobility will be reshaped by geopolitics and technology. But there are still some fundamental issues that we are going to address today. International student education, ISE for short, is a crucial lens through which we can better understand the logic, patterns, challenges, and the prospects of China's higher education in the global national framework. And more importantly, this lens provides insights into how China's higher education system between globalization and neoliberalism versus centralized governance, national will. We also hope the case of ISE in China could serve as a reference for other emerging host destinations after the pandemic. Also, it hopes to contribute to the growing scholarly discussion on internationalization of higher education into universities' third mission of service to society across different countries. So the perspective of connecting ISE and the broader society is largely absent from the mainstream literature. Past studies on international students or international student education have focused on individual student experiences, such as motivation, a choice, socio-cultural adaptation, learning outcome, etc. In these studies, international student is seen as a concept that draws resources, focus, and infrastructure away from social engagement, rather than a tool to support social engagement and responsibility. This competitive rather supportive relationship between ISE and society has caused many public debates on the legitimacy of ISE in China. For example, the public showed strong resistance to the newly drafted foreigners' permanent residence in the year 2019, and there was also a lot of dissatisfaction on the supranational treatment of foreign students in China. So therefore, it is necessary to reflect on the social responsibility component of internationalization and international student education in a systematic and conceptualized way. So this presentation will address ISE's connection with the broader society, the framework of ISE for society, and also the difference between Cynic and Western conceptualization of key terms like society, state, will be discussed, and ISE's contribution to social justice, economic development, and public goods will be analyzed based on empirical data. Okay, so before I introduce some of the framework, Hudia will introduce briefly the development and historical development of China's ISE. Okay, Hudia.
So we'd like just to quickly introduce China's IC by briefly illustrating the four major historical periods of IC in China and the current landscape of IC. So from 1950s to the beginning of the reform and opening up policy, hosting international students is a national mission, and universities own very limited authority over administration of international education. Then China's IC enters a period of system construction with the market economy reform was intensified. And the third period since mid 1990s witnessed an enrollment expansion of international students, both internationalization agenda and world-class building movement influenced China's international education. Upon entering the new century, there's a re-emerging nationalism in the internationalization of higher ed. So China has started playing an increasingly important role in several transnational efforts on higher ed qualification assurance system buildings, and so forth. So a brief overall picture of China's higher education system and its international student education. About 1,000 Chinese higher education institutions, mostly public ones, are currently receiving international students studying in China. Since 2018, over 50% international students are degree-seeking students, and 3/4 are at postgraduate level. And we can see there exists regional and institutional imbalance in terms of the distribution of international students. Most international students study in economically advanced areas in China, namely Beijing, Shanghai, and some big coastal cities. And for the type of host universities, about 75% of scholarship receivers go to research intensive universities, and branch campuses of some US or UK universities such as NYU Shanghai and Xi'an Jiaotong University, Liverpool. These campuses have very high percentages of international students, and also medical schools. Medical institutions of China host high proportions of international students studying in China. So here's a brief picture, overall picture of the current landscape of China's IC.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and then in terms of the framework of internationalization in higher education for society, it's proposed by Brandenburg in the year 2020, and actually it's based on a stream of scholarly discussion on the definition and also the function of internationalization of higher education. Professor De Witt raised a new definition of internationalization of higher education in 2015. He emphasizes the nature of the relationship between internationalization and society, describing it as being to intentionally make a meaningful contribution to society. This clearly extends the impact of internationalization beyond the confines of the academy. The framework of the internationalization in higher education for society was then developed to address the disconnect between internationalization of higher education and the third mission of higher education. Recent studies in this regard call for a comprehensive, inclusive vision of internationalization that systematically and strategically extends its benefits into local and distant communities. This is mainly the Western approach to conceptualize the relationship between higher education and society. But China is taking a very different approach to conceptualize the the relationship between higher education and society. So when Chinese people, even many Chinese higher education scholars are talking about society, state, universities, actually they are referring to very different things from Western scholars. So before we talk about the relationship between state, society, and higher education, we have to clarify some of the differences in the very basic concepts. In Western countries, society was divided between the sphere of state, the sphere of economic market, the sphere of civil society, and the sphere of the individual. But in China, the border between state and society is very unclear. The social system is hierarchical in terms of individual, family, state, and society, and 天下, all under heaven. So that's why when in China, when we are talking about higher education, the higher education is more deeply embedded in state compared to the North American higher education system. So the next slide. As Professor Marginson illustrated it well, a university autonomy discusses the extent to which universities are autonomous parts of the state or part of civil society. So he compared the three systems, higher education systems, and the relationship between higher education and the state. So in the UK, institutions lie between the state and civil society. In the US, higher education institutions are nested more in civil society. But in China, the questions about university autonomy plays out within the boundaries of the state rather than the boundary between the state and society. So the paradox of ISE, international student education in China, is that so on the one hand, it is not seen as component of national higher education system. So that means it is the supplementary of national higher education, and there is less control over it from the state. But on the other hand, as an individual unit of higher education, it has to serve the state's will. So one distinct characteristics in governing China's international student education is the government institution partnership, which is very different from the governing pattern of national higher education system. The central government controls at to a very weak extent overall policy orientation and quality assurance for the international student education. So individual universities have the autonomy, have the great autonomy to operate international student education in the process of recruitment, curriculum and teaching, finance, and administration. So such a process is loosely managed, contrasting to the strict government control in the higher education of domestic students. Okay. So based on all the discussion on the theoretical foundation, the framework, and also the differences between conceptualization of the terminology, we proposed this ISE for society framework in China. So ISE aims at contributing the society in terms of the three domains: social justice, economic development, and also public good. And also the ISE and the society engagement is happening in various spaces: local, regional, national, international. So it may bring the global to the local, or the local to the global, or bring the regional to global, or global to regional. In light of this framework, we will explore the two questions. The first question is under the ISE for society framework, how does China's ISE manifest itself? And then what forces have shaped the ISE of China?
So we'll justify and discuss the ways in which China's ISE is linked to the three models that pursue to serve society. So first, the social justice goals focus on addressing social disadvantage and structural inequality and emphasizing student and community empowerment. At this point, we found that China's IC has addressed the unequal distribution of global educational resources and empowers some communities that tend to be historically disadvantaged. Most of the top 10 sending countries were low to middle income countries in global south. And China is particularly welcoming students from lower income African countries, and African countries now constitute 17% of all international students studying in China. But the downside of it, from the local and national perspective, is that ISE has intensified the inequality or the stratification of Chinese higher education system. At national level, as we talked about earlier, most international students study in universities that in those economically advanced areas. At institutional level, our data show that research-intensive universities receive an average of 962 students per institutions, while non-research universities hosted 159 students per institution. The disproportionate distribution of international students meant that universities at the top of the hierarchy benefited most from both economic gains, tuition fees, and international influences, that is, intercultural exposure, opportunities, and resources. This reality perpetuates the imbalance between regions and between institutions and hold back the social justice goals that the ICE aims to achieve. And the second model, we discussed the goals of the economic development goals that center on local or regional economic growth. Studies have shown that ISE contributes to China's economy and the Sino-foreign trade. So the latest official data capturing international student revenue dated back to 10 years ago. But it says international students contributed 28.3 billion RMB to China's economy. And from 2012 to the present, the number of international students studying in China has almost doubled. So the contribution to the economy is expected to rise. And also we cited a Jiangsu, for example, for Jiangsu province, and it's about 57 million yuan contribution to the economy for the year of 2010. And China's IC positively prompt export and trade and China's foreign direct investment and overseas mergers and acquisitions. At regional level, China's IC contributes to Sino-foreign trade by training a large number of students who learn the soft skills in China that can be used in their work back home. Many international graduates actively participate in multilateral trade in the regional economy. In our interviews, an IC leader in Thailand mentioned the trade agreement between China and ASEAN and noted that Thailand's labor market has a growing demand for Chinese-speaking labor. And correspondingly, a Thai student thought that he would accumulate experience dealing with and doing business with Chinese while studying here. He mentioned that the personal connections here are important for him, and that will lay a good foundation for him to rapidly enter into the Sino-Thai trade industry in the future. However, in terms of providing professional skills, there's still a gap between China and traditional international student hosts. International cooperations based in China added that, according to our interviews, interviews with their HR, they added that their demand for international students is quite low. Also, the legal and visa limitations are very primary reasons. Okay, the third model, we talked about the public, we discussed the public good goals related to China's ISE. So the public good is perceived as a certain function or social contribution of higher ed, emphasizing its public nature. The goals of public good include, but not limited to, supporting social integration, developing global citizens, and supporting science and knowledge exchange and so forth. So overall, our findings show that China's ISE does not support most of the public good goals. It seems to have failed in a soft power projection. According to many students we interviewed, China's higher education has formed the international reputation of low cost, low competition, emissions, and generous scholarship. Although some top universities in China have gained global visibility in projecting soft power, and China also has a bunch of good STEM subjects and universities that are good at STEM disciplines. But China's overall higher education level and quality have not been recognized by the current international students or the group of prospective international students that Chinese institutions may target for. So secondly, ISE's connection to the local society is quite weak. At local level, however, there are a few universities that benefited local society through ISE. Yunnan and Guangxi are two southwestern border provinces in China. They were quite achievers in supporting the public good. They both recruited a lot of international students from neighboring countries in South Asia and Southeast Asia. For example, Yunnan University collaborated with neighboring Asian countries such as Myanmar on ecology and biodiversity fields and actively promote environmental and sustainable development of the entire region to their domestic and international students, which highlights scientific research function to serve the local society. While on the positive side, China's ISE has contributed to promoting students' global competency, and students mentioned that China has become an ideal alternative for exploring higher education in another country and improving their global competencies. For example, Tsinghua has led a multilateral initiative to establish a World MOOC Alliance and provide numerous learning resources for global students. In a summary, so by discussing China's ISE and its relationship to the three models, we conclude that there are two major forces that shape the development of ISE in China. First, ISE is treated as an instrument to achieve other purposes, such as increasing international presence, then accomplishing the university's first, second, and third mission. Developing ISE is also closely linked to gaining more institutional resources from the government. And secondly, the current competing higher education policy priorities have set constraints on institutional agencies in operating ISE. The excellence-oriented double first-class plan and the aid-oriented Belt and Road Initiative higher education plan represents the two contrasting or conflicting orientations of internationalization. Thus, universities of different levels and regions have different considerations and exercise agencies. Some top universities in China, though, such as Tsinghua, though, are trying to integrate the two discourses in its ISE practices. Like we mentioned before, it's proactively collaborating with global universities by research collaboration and student exchange. At the meantime, it took the lead in launching the Asian University Alliance to nurture or try make efforts to nurture the next generation of global and regional talents in Asia.
Okay, so here we will briefly conclude the previous findings. So according to our study, we find that there exists a long way for China's ISE to realize the goals of contributing to social justice, economic development, and the public good. The ISE in China is kind of an island situated within a not very accommodating macro system. Yeah, this conclusion differs from previous studies that examined the ISE from only within higher education. Although there are some merit and positive sides in benefiting a regional economic trade and cultivating human resources for the global South, many other important dimensions of internationalization for society are currently not realized for ISE in China. And the second, the conflicts and in coordination between policy priorities should be reconciled. We have noticed that in China's case, universities are pulled to two different directions, the excellence-oriented direction versus aid-oriented direction with different ISE goals and activities. Yeah, for the excellence-oriented direction, the universities have to, cooperate with the world-class universities, which are mainly located in the US or Europe, and to promote student exchange between China and those regions. However, for the aid-oriented direction, the universities have to work with the less developed higher education systems and to help them to build their higher education system. So these fragmented internationalization activities in China is particularly salient due to the strong governance influence, diplomatic and reputation prioritization. So in our interviews, this caused a lot of confusion and also complaints for Chinese universities. That's the second conclusion remark. And the third one is that creating a social environment of inclusiveness and openness is critical. While universities' ranking and education quality are highly regarded, an open, safe, inclusive, accommodating environment will be critical for international students from various backgrounds, especially in the post-pandemic world. And lastly, reconceptualizing and reconstructing the higher education evaluation and the ranking systems are also critical. If more social services indices on ISE are included, universities might be more incentivized to work towards social justice and the public good goals. Okay, so we will stop by here and and leave the rest of the time for the questions and the discussion session.
And we have them in the chat already. I mean, there's a run of 5 or so already built up, and that shows, I think, that you've really laid out the issues clearly and been able to shape a good conversation as a result. I'm going to say something at the start, and then I'll bring in Janina with the first question. I was really, I'm struck by the comparison between the Western countries and China, in how the different political culture and the different configuration of state, society, and university plays out in this realm. And my conclusion from what you presented on that, Wen, was that the difference in international education is not as great as it is in some other respects. I mean, in China, the whole question of the service role, as the Americans call it, of universities, a sort of outreach, community-focused role, or the economy, broadly speaking, that's endemic in China. That's sort of built in, that, as you say, the boundary between state and society and university is blurred, and university is part of both all the time. And, it's quite natural to serve society and connect to society. It doesn't have to be added in as a kind of extra mission on top of teaching and research. So there's a taken for grantedness about that. And I think that's a real advantage that the Chinese higher education system has, that its embeddedness in society makes a lot of things much more straightforward. On the other hand, you don't have the capacity that universities in the West have to step away from the whole relationship with the state and have this fantasy that you are independent and freely criticize. And sometimes that's quite useful for the society, that universities can do that. A lot of the time, it leads to fairly empty rhetoric. And nothing much happens, and states are pretty good at ignoring it. But both systems have their advantages and disadvantages, as we all know. But in relation to international education, I thought you showed us that that the state orders the sector in this way, quite from on high, quite a long way away, and the real work and the real activity happens at the university level. Universities have a lot of practical autonomy, as they do in many respects in China, in research and other areas, which enables them to be what they are. And in relation to international education, they have lots of responsibility and lots of autonomy. Now, that's not that different, I think, to the situation in the European and North American worlds. Where the state does step in relation to immigration policy quite a lot. That is, it decides who gets into international education. It decides the balance of enrolments, often between countries. It decides how many, in the case of UK, for example, how many each university gets. It's quite interventionist at that macro level, and then at the micro level, it hands things over. So again, I think you've got this, fairly similar model of a broad state ordering, with the state being able to step in when it wants if there's a problem, as it does in China. But a lot of autonomy. In relation to the question of the integration between international students and society and the service mission, if you like, in the Western sense, the North American, European countries have not made much progress with this problem. It's not surprising, because there's no automatic links into society anyway. But I think there's a sort of larger issue there about international education not having an intrinsic connection to the society at all, most of the time in any society. These students are not going to stay, most of them. They're going to leave again. There's no ongoing relationship. So why should local communities, unless they're directly embedded in the economics of the international education, like providing services for them, why should local communities really form an ongoing relationship? And why should the students form a relationship with local communities? And it kind of works in the border zones, as he said. It works like in southeastern China and near the border with Southeast Asia. It works near Myanmar. It works, in different ways also in close to Central Asia. I've got a student doing a thesis on Belt and Road programs in Gansu and Xinjiang, and it's clear that there's a link there between Central Asian international students and local society that's kind of meaningful. But most of the time it's not, and I think that's a kind of ongoing struggle. Now, and I don't think we're ever any of us going to solve it very well. And if we set expectations that are too high here, we'll be unsuccessful. So we need to identify those zones where a productive relationship is possible, like border zones and like highly internationalized parts of society and economy, the cultural sector, the internationalized business sectors in the capital cities, and so on. In those areas, you can build stronger relationships because they've got meaning, they've got ongoing potential. Question I wanted to ask you was about scholarships, because going back to your other point about the tension between the WCU program and the sort of foreign aid aspect of international students. I mean, we find that in the UK, like where I am, our international students coming in are often our strongest intellectual force, you know, that they're highly selected in our case, and those who get scholarships are really good, and they drive our quality in many respects. They improve our work. They improve the work of everyone else around them. So getting high quality international students can work in with a WCU objective, but only if the scholarship selection process is strongly meritocratic. Is anyone working on that problem that you know? I mean, in our field, I mean, anyone doing research on the process of granting scholarships, the question of academic rigor, the level at which the scholarships are being granted, that sort of thing, because I think that is a very instrumental aspect of policy.
Mm-hmm. Yes, Hudia, can you can you answer this question? Yes.
About the scholarship.
Mm-hmm.
I think
Yes, we've done some of
I think the number of government scholarships allocating to African country students is increasing over the years. But I think according to data, the number of African students who came to China with the government scholarship is a lot smaller than we expected, or than people know. So about 20% of all the international degree-seeking students currently in China are government scholarship receivers. So about like 20% of them got the scholarship, and the scholarship, the amount of the scholarship is, and it's not that much as the media or the public thought. So so I think like for so also I saw a question about that as well, about like how China is attracting African students. So I want to address that too. So I think
might go into the questions, and in that case, I mean,
I think yes, in the chat box, someone is recommending, Catherine, who is doing a project on the CSC scholarship. Yes, that's kind of black box for the scholarship granting, and I also the process of granting scholarship granting varies, varies across different institutions. For the research intensive universities, the elite universities, it's highly selective. It's highly selective. But for those like non-research universities, quantitative, I mean the quantity, the number of international students is still kind of the primary priority for them to enroll more international students. So I understand your challenge about the intellectual quality of international students, and also that might be kind of hinder the internationalization. I mean the advantage of internationalization of higher education brings to Chinese universities. That's probably the biggest issue. So in the past few years, the government has formed a few quality criteria for international student education, but still at a very weak, controlling level, as I just said, because ISE is not considered to be the the national higher education system
Mm,
in
mm,
China.
mm.
So the control is kind of indirect control. It's more like market oriented. Yeah.
Which is what happened in the West as well. I mean, we know that financing drives where quality students go. And so the policy task is to arrive at the right mix of foreign aid-based scholarships and academic criteria-driven scholarships. And, if the right mix is there, and that can be judiciously matched to the capabilities of institutions and their needs, then over time, presumably, both objectives can be met. Now, what I'm going to do is there's such a good set of questions here. I'm going to bring people in groups of 2 and 3. So we're going to start with Janina Duda and then Glenn Chantelia. We'll get you to give your questions one after another before our presenters answer. So first, Janina, please.
Thank you, Simon. Thank you, Wen Wen and Dihu, because it's really a very good topic and so important at so many levels. We've had the Chinese students studying in the West, as you've said, and now it's the internal opening to students. So my question has been partially tackled already. I was wondering whether there was a systematic approach to attracting students, international students, but also the African students, whose rise was the highest, I believe. Are you targeting students who would be studying any particular industries, skills? How are they attracted? Are there any particular schemes as well? And then it takes me also to the question whether, like, what the perception is of the international students by local academics, and hence also, are they, the local academics, are they supported somehow in teaching international students? Because obviously we know that the cultures of teaching are slightly different, and then comes the question of language and communication. So how is there an approach that's been a policy it's being developed? Thank you.
Okay, that's the don't answer yet. No, wait, we'll take Glenn Chantelia as well, because we've got a lot of questions. We need to do them in bunches. Glenn? Hello, Glenn.
Hi, Simon. Just a moment, okay? Good. My commendations to a very good presentation by both of you. And I know Tsinghua University because I'm from Thailand, the Assumption University of Thailand. My question to you is, your presentation has really been a kind of opener to me. I've taught Chinese students, but I was kind of struck by the state control over education. And to me, the long-term question is twofold. Number one, the innovations that have existed or really occur in China right now, they need to be extended, and international students coming in might contribute to that. But then on the other hand, what about opening up society to a far more freer and open system to allow that dialogue to take place? Okay, so, and many of my students are frustrated by this. Okay, they end up working in the Bank of China or state institutions without much chance of being innovative after having studied in an international setting. Okay, so I wonder if your studies, factored in this kind of consideration. Okay, thank you.
Hi, Glenn. Yeah, thank you for your question. Can I clarify a bit? What do you mean by the some of the international students complain about the lack of open? Do you mean what do you mean by the open discussion or innovation? What do you mean by innovation for international students? Do you mean the pedagogy or what do you mean by that? Yeah.
Well, even within pedagogy, while the Chinese students have contributed in an offshore setting like at Assumption University, okay, my question is, what about the reverse? If international students were to come to China and to be just put into the pedagogical box, if you will, okay, and sort of grounded and machinated through that, would there be scope for them, to have a chance to contribute to innovation, which I think would sustain, the lifelong learning paradigm, if you will. Okay, so that was really the tenor of my question.
Okay, so yeah, I'm not sure whether I can answer all the questions because there are a couple of questions, good questions asked by Glenn and Janina. So yeah, I probably will start from Glenn's question. So yeah, I think that's kind of systematic, question. That's not only an isolated question to solve the problem of innovation, innovation environment in Chinese universities. Probably is not only a problem for international students, but also a problem for the national higher education system in China. But in terms of international students, yes, you are correct. One of the biggest contribution of international students to the public good is that they will bring a kind of very different, cultural background. And this diversified cultural background will largely promote innovation in Chinese, on Chinese campus. But the thing is that first, as Simon just mentioned, the intellectual quality of international students in China, because we have a very low, we have a very low requirement for them to enroll into Chinese universities. So the biggest attraction of Chinese higher education for international students, according to our research, is the low cost, the low requirement of the low competitiveness of the enrollment examination, and also so that's probably the quality of higher education of Chinese higher education hasn't become a major attraction of international students. So Chinese higher education so far is kind of stepstone of the international mobility market, which means that the less developed country students will send their students to China, and then they will go to some other the center countries. So it's kind of systematic issues to raise the innovation in Chinese higher education to promote to provide more like opportunities for international students. So number one, we have to attract the best international students, and then we have to provide a kind of free and open university campus environment for them. Yeah, so that's a kind of systematic thing. That's not just to change one thing or one aspect, one factor of university. And also the whole system, the whole higher education system, the innovation atmosphere of Chinese higher education is another big issue, which we cannot answer in this talk. Yeah. So
well, let's take some more questions. There's that whole question of the innovative atmosphere. There's a lot of discussion about that going on, and a lot of research is going into that at the moment. I noticed papers have been written in the English language literature on that topic quite a lot. I'll bring in three more. Let's start with Miguel Antonio Lim, please.
Hi, good afternoon from the University of Manchester. So Miguel from Manchester. We always forget to say that. Thanks for reminding us, Simon. Yes. Yeah, thank you very much, Wen Wen and Jehu. My question was it's actually about the small part of, I guess, the ISE system, which is Chinese universities and higher education institutions and their activities outside of China. So there are a small number of branch campuses or joint partnerships with Chinese universities, but in other countries. And I guess this is potentially interesting because, first of all, numerically there are fewer, but perhaps this is a sign of future directions or future trends in Chinese higher education. I think about this article written by colleagues from Xiamen University, I think in Chinese Education and Society some time ago, where they spoke about the going out policy of Chinese foreign cooperation. And I guess it's not a surprise that colleagues from Xiamen wrote that given their branch campus in Malaysia. And there's also news about the political debate around the branch campus of Fudan University here in Europe, in Hungary. What do you think is the perception of policymakers and I guess the general public about the contributions to public good, the things that you mentioned about social justice? Are these activities, can these activities be seen in that framework? Do they matter to policymakers? I know that you said that there are these two, some of these instrumentalist logics, such as aid. Is this seen as aid, or is this seen as competence building? So it just, yeah, could you talk a little about this smaller part, but I think very interesting part in this ISE space for Chinese higher education?
Okay, before you do, remember that one international branch campuses. David Mills is next.
Great, thank you, and Wen Wen, and that was a really fascinating talk, both of you. Really enjoyed it. There's lots of connections. We just completed 30 interviews with African doctoral students, either finishing or completing their PhDs in various Chinese universities. So we must compare notes. I guess my comment really for now is this distinction between excellence and foreign aid, but also more importantly, the question around soft power. I'm not sure if it's possible at this early stage to assess, okay, well, you know, there's a limited soft power element to this, because soft power is one of those sort of very, very ambiguous things that happens and develops over time. And you know, could one say, well, you invest in the possibility of soft power, even if you're not sure when and how it pays off, but it's a sort of long-term investment. Whether you want to comment on that in relationship to the Chinese state's vision, for example, through FOCAC, which is the China-Africa Collaboration Forum.
Okay, hold that thought as well, international branch campuses and soft power. The third one is from David Law, and I'm also going to bring in Hans de Wit as well. So David Law first.
Thank you, Simon. Just a quickie from me. I can't do justice to the richness of your theoretical approach, so it's an empirical question on language of instruction. I saw some data recently which suggests that there are more Thai students in China than there are combined in USA and UK. So I think we've perhaps misunderstood how dramatic the rise has been of degree-seeking students in China from outside China. And I'd just like to ask about the language of instruction for these students. Is it in English or is it in Mandarin?
Okay, so remember that Thai students is the third one, and the fourth one is from Hans de Wit.
Hello, and thank you very much, Hans de Wit, Center for International
Hi, Hans. Yeah.
Thank you for your great presentation, very interesting. First, I have a comment. I mean, of course, international students in China are increasing rapidly, as you notice. But as you also notice, most of them stay only for the study, but have no chance to stay on after their graduation. So the impact on society is much more shorter than it would be, for instance, in a country like Canada or even the United States, where they have had an enormous impact on society in many aspects. So that's, in my view, a certain limitation, which still China has in the sense of impact. Would not be the impact on society of returning Chinese internet students and scholars from abroad much higher on society, and also be a big challenge for China because they bring in this perspective from a different kind of experience abroad. So that's my main question. Thank you, but very interesting and very fascinating.
Okay, so colleagues, remember you've got international branch campuses from Miguel, soft power from David, you've got Thai students from David Law, and now you've got lack of migration opportunities and therefore lack of impact of international students from Hans. I think we've got time for your answers before we close.
Yes, Hudia, could you pick one question or a few questions from this, all of these fascinating questions to answer, and I will just prepare for a few of others. Probably the branch campus one you might.
Right. I would quickly answer to the Thai students one first, and that's so that question asks about the language and instruction for international students in China. So as we so currently, so we have more than 50% of international students who are seeking degrees in China. So they are studying in Chinese classrooms in English. So the instructions are mostly English, and yeah, and for the other half of the students, they are kind of learning languages or learning Chinese or learning other disciplines without degrees. So they're on some like cultural exchanges programs or some like training programs here in China. So the teaching for them are mostly bilingual, like Chinese and English. So they're just here to learn Chinese. So that's a quick answer to that question. Yeah, and also the satellite campus question. Yeah, I agree. So this particular research, we don't discuss that those initiatives or those branches that China set abroad. So definitely, but I think those initiatives or those branches are studied under the framework of the political perspectives most often. So, and it's kind of a part of the social, like the soft power projection. That is seen as a social power, a soft power projection that the government aims to achieve. So yeah, I think, what else?
Well, you've done pretty well, actually, because you sort of answered the soft power question and sort of answered the international branch campuses question. We've still got Hans's sort of perspective on, sort of migration and lack of international students don't stay after graduation in China the way they stay in Canada or the US, and maybe that's a kind of limitation of what these programs can achieve about embedding in society.
Yes.
Yeah.
So yeah, I would take.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Probably. I would take Hans' question as kind of like a suggestion for the kind of limitation of our. So I wouldn't answer that question, but that's very good, suggestion for our future study. So I just want to quickly respond to Professor David Mills' question about soft power. Yes, you are right. It's hard to measure, soft power, the effectiveness or the of soft power at this moment, because there's limited evidence, and even the concept itself is kind of very ambiguity, a lot of ambiguity in this. But I think our point is that, there are some surveys about the Belt and the Road countries about their perceptions towards Chinese higher education. So yes, so the results is not that satisfied, because we offered a lot of scholarship to the students, international students from those countries. However, the public perception towards Chinese higher education is not as good as we expected. So, and also the failure of Confucian Institute, and also because Confucian Institute also plays an important role in enrolling international students. So they are kind of agent in enrolling international students. Yes, the evidence is limited, so we cannot give a a simple answer of whether the soft power is successful or not. But yeah, thank you for addressing this question. Yeah, we just,
Well, it's early days yet, isn't it, on the question of what going out means, and what going out is going to embody. And I mean, European countries have been doing it since the 15th, 16th century, and they've been going out in all kinds of ways, and a greater or lesser degree of value for the world. And it's what China does with its global role is just beginning to be shaped.
Yes,
so I guess our sense of what
I agree.
yeah, and of course, as you've said, I mean, soft power is something you judge only in the medium and longer term. So, but it's just, the question is good because it's a way of talking about what's China doing in Africa and so on, and what does Belt and Road mean, and what is China in the world now, and gee, what an important topic it is for everyone, I think. And we'll continue to return to it again and again in this series. So I want to thank you both. I thought that was a superb paper, so well presented, such good slides, so clear. And you laid out very honestly and frankly the issues and the problems that you see, all the open-ended questions, the opportunities for research to pursue them, the crucial policy issues that are involved. Always you get a sense in China of an intelligent state at work, but you also get a sense of, crossing the river by feeling the stones as well. And that's in some ways a good thing, I think, that ability to be reflexive about where you're going or what you're doing all the time. And that comes through in your paper today, that reflexivity, that healthy way of thinking, what works and what doesn't work, what are we trying to achieve here, what are our goals, and adjusting as you go. And I think we all do that as researchers too. So thank you for enriching our series today. We want to see you both back again. And you made an equal contribution, and which is really good, when you have two presenters. Our next webinar, colleagues, is we go to the University of Manchester, and Miguel is with us again as part of a large team with Jenna Mettelmeier, Sylvie Rittlomer, Joseph Ploner, and Heather Cockayne, and they're going to take us into an imagined concept, and they're going to ask us, what do ethical practices with international students look like? A kind of John Lennon, imagine if there was a good international education, what would it be like? I think it's a great topic. This is such a good group of researchers now, I think, doing the best work maybe in the UK at the moment on international education. So this will be a great webinar. So do come and join us on Tuesday. Thanks again to both Wen and to Di Hu, and we'll see you both again, I hope. Bye for now.
Bye for now. Thank you, Simon. Yeah, thank you, David. Thank you, everybody. Yeah, thank you.